June 17, 1944, before dawn on Saipan, when engines were only a rumor in the blackness and the volcanic dust still hung cold over the airfield, a wedge of Japanese Type 95s came clattering out of the dark with the confidence of men who had survived China and the Mongolian border and believed steel was a kind of prayer that could not be denied. And the Marines, half buried in foxholes with Browning Mem 2 says braced into the earth, squeezed their triggers and watched fat orange tracers walk into the hulls and do something nobody on the Japanese side truly expected in their bones: go in one side and come out the other, as if the armor were the lid of a tin. And in that obscene, riveting instant the myth of the invincible Hago evaporated like breath on cold glass and left only the cruel arithmetic of industrial war. The story does not begin with humiliation, but with momentum, not with wrecks burning by an airstrip, but with a design culture that prized movement over mass, and believed that the right tank for empire was the one that could travel far, be built quickly, and shrug off rifle fire while infantry ran in its shadow. And it is precisely because the Type 95 excelled at the war Japan expected, fast columns on bad roads, enemies with few guns that truly mattered, that it failed so completely in the war Japan actually got, where a common heavy machine gun, fired by a sweating corporal behind a sandbag wall, could open a tank like a door. In the years before the Pacific erupted, the Hago seemed reasonable, even elegant in its simplicity, a 7-ton promise that speed and surprise could substitute for the weight Japan's factories could not easily supply, and the men who crewed it learned habits of aggression and certainty that made perfect sense against foes who lacked armor and radios and doctrine, which is why their shock on Saipan was not theatrical but existential, a moment when training collided with physics and physics did what it always does. For the Marines, the discovery that 50-caliber armor-piercing rounds would scythe through 12 millimeters of face-hardened plate at the distances that night fighting forces upon you was not just a tactical note to be filed and briefed. It was a release of tension and a recalibration of fear, because tank silhouettes that had haunted Guadalcanal foxholes now became targets for a weapon every platoon already trusted, and that shift from dread to method would ripple through the island campaign far beyond one shattered counterattack. This is a story about a light tank born in the early 1930s out of practical constraints and doctrinal choices, about the intoxicating feedback loop of early victories, and about the moment when those choices met American firepower and American production, and found themselves out of time, out of thickness, and out of luck. It begins in 1933, with a problem written in kilometers and hours rather than in calibers and millimeters, because the Japanese Army's workhorse, the Type 89, could plod with stout infantry but could not accompany motorized columns that leapt ahead on trucks, and the planners who studied Manchurian distances and Chinese maps understood that an empire stretched by rail and dirt track needed a tank that could move like a convoy rather than like a parade. So the specification that Summer read like a manifesto of mobility about 7 tons, a 37mm gun to SWAT fieldworks and light armor, protection sufficient against rifles and ordinary machine guns, and above all a road speed that made the term support mean arrive on time. Mitsubishi took the brief, and Tomio Hara, whose name would become synonymous with the bell crank suspension the world now recognizes on every Japanese interwar chassis, conjured a running gear that was forgiving to build and forgiving to maintain, a practical trick that mattered when your front stretched thousands of kilometers from steel mills, and when the first prototypes ran they did exactly what the bureaucracy had asked of them: 40-ish kilometers per hour on decent surfaces, credible pace across uneven ground, and a temperament that mechanics could coax with limited tools and tighter schedules. The armor was thin because it was designed to be thin, a calculation not of ignorance but of expected opponents. 12 millimeters on the turret and nose to break up ball rounds and discourage light guns, 9 on the roof and less where mass could be saved. And if this seems suicidal in hindsight, it is only because hindsight knows that a Browning heavy machine gun would become as common to American units as their canteens, whereas the men who approved the Type 95 measured risk against Chinese infantry and the occasional Soviet patrol, and judged the balance acceptable. In that light, the 3-man crew, driver, hull gunner, and an overburdened commander who aimed, loaded, and led from a hand-cranked turret was not a flaw but an economy, A way to put more vehicles into the field with fewer radios, fewer trained specialists and crucially fewer tons of steel per hull. Trials in Manchuria and at home confirmed what the paper already suggested. The Hago was a dart rather than a hammer, lively to steer, twitchy over broken ground and fond of its air-cooled diesel that drank fuel at a rate workable for long patrols, and though the ride pitched and the gun bucked when the driver refused to slow, the institution decided that a rough shot delivered quickly was better than a smooth shot arriving late, and thus the tank that would terrify Chinese garrisons and alarm British positions in Malaya entered production with its virtues and its doom already welded in. Early combat wrote flattering letters home because a light tank that is the only tank on the field is a terrifying thing, and the Hago in 1937 and 1938 could rip wire, nose through walls and scatter infantry who had never been asked to stand in front of tracked armor, which was why crews developed the aggressive style that the doctrine encouraged, a habit of closing fast and flooding target areas with machine gun fire, while the 37mm spat high explosive into embrasures. Even the bruising at Kholkhin Gol, where Soviet 45s punched back and Japanese losses mounted, did not erase the broader institutional belief that the answer lay in tactics and nerve rather than in a fundamental rethink of armor and crew and gun, and so the design stayed as it was while success in China and early victories in the Philippines and Malaya whispered that speed still ruled, that the Pacific, its plantations and its tracks and its villages was a theater made for lightness, and that is how a tank optimized for yesterday's opponent arrived on Saipan with crews who trusted it, commanders who counted on it, and plate that a Marine's heavy machine gun could unbutton like a jacket, the collision of doctrine and reality waiting in the dark just beyond the airfield lights. On Saipan, the lesson announced itself in engine noise and in the pale glow of tracers that stitched the dark like hot wire, because Colonel Takashi Goto's 9th Tank Regiment, a mixed herd of Hugos and Chiha mediums whose crews had been taught by experience to trust speed, surprise and the psychological weight of tracked steel, rolled out before dawn on June 17, with the deliberate confidence of men who had rehearsed their routes and checked their belts, and believed that shock, if properly delivered, could tear a hole in the American line wide enough for infantry to pour through. Yet what they met beyond the cane fields and coral berms was not panic, but a jungle of prepared positions where Marine machine gun teams had dragged their Browning M2 sets into scooped earth and low revetments, had stacked linked belts of armor-piercing ammunition within arm's reach, and had quietly agreed among themselves that if tanks came they would aim low and stay on the target until something gave. So when the first silhouettes slid out of the gloom, small turrets, slab sides, that telltale diesel rattle, the gunners did what training and fear had taught them. They rode the butterfly triggers until the heavy receivers hammered, and the orange embers that arced across the night struck plate with a flat, sick sound that was not a ricochet but an entry, the difference immediately visible in sparks seen blooming inside hatches, and in the way vehicles that should have shrugged off bullets suddenly staggered, slowed and bled smoke from vents they could not protect, and in those seconds before Shermans even found their gears, the Pacific revealed a new rule that a weapon built to tear wings from aircraft could unmake a tank whose armor had been budgeted against a different century. The Japanese formation tried to do what doctrine demanded: close the range, spray the line with coaxial fire, keep moving so the enemy could not fix you in their sights. But the physics were wrong now because at 150-200 meters, 50 AP round did not negotiate with 12 millimeters of face-hardened steel. It parted it, and inside those cramped compartments where a commander stood to aim and load and lead without a seat or basket, penetration meant ricochets and spall and sudden noise that was more scream than sound. It meant an engine coughing once and seizing under a burst through a 6mm deck. It meant a loader pitching forward and never finishing the motion. It meant a crew whose habits from China, heads up in hatches to see and signal, became fatal exposures marked by the neat, brutal circles that appeared where a visor had been. Across short stretches of coral flat the Shermans woke, their radial or twin diesel hearts turning over with the patient certainty of weight, and when they moved up to the perimeter and began to trade shots the disparity that men had felt but not measured became explicit. A 30-ton hull with sloped 51mm plate, that rendered Japanese 37s and 57s into sparks and dents, a stabilized 75 whose first calm round into a Hago's flank turned thin armor and stacked ammunition into a single orange flower, a turret that swept on power traverse while a marine gunner stayed welded to his telescopic sight, and radios in every vehicle keeping the lines stitched together while Japanese tank commanders waved flags that nobody could see through smoke and fear. Yet even in that lopsided exchange the night stayed chaotic and personal, with tanks rolling over foxholes while the men inside pressed themselves into the earth and counted bogey wheels, with one private jamming a coconut log into a track run so the vehicle began to pirouette stupidly until a hatch cracked open and a thermite grenade ended the conversation, with infantry who had ridden out clinging to armor now flung across the ground in small furious knots trying to work around the flanks and finding instead that every American platoon had a heavy gun somewhere, on a half-track, on a tripod, on a sandbag wall, and that each of those guns could end a tank as surely as a cannon if the range and the angle were right. When the sun finally rinsed the color back into the field, the count was an inventory of doctrine colliding with industry, scores of Japanese tanks burned or stunned in place, their exits blown outward, their sides freckled by neat holes you could push fingers through, and Marines moving among them with the quiet of men who have learned something permanent, pointing out to each other where the rounds had gone in and come out, explaining almost conversationally that you aim at the side plates or the engine deck, or straight through the turret, if you are close, that you hold the trigger and feed the belt and trust the gun, and that the thing that was supposed to frighten you is in this theater and at this hour, just another target that dies when you refuse to blink. In the aftermath, when the beachhead was secure, and the smoke over Garapan rose like a dirty halo, Marine engineers and ordnance officers walked through the graveyard of steel to catalogue what had happened, and what they found was not mystery but inevitability, laid bare in centimeters and rivet lines. The Type 95 Hago, that agile creature of the 1930s, was a time capsule pretending to be a tank of 1944. Its armor, once considered an intelligent compromise, was revealed as a liability so severe that even small-caliber automatic fire could split it at the seams. 12 millimeters of face-hardened plate, once enough to deflect rifle fire, was now an invitation to the kind of weapons the Americans carried by default. You could see the evidence written in geometry, entry holes perfectly circular on the near side, exit holes torn and jagged where the kinetic energy had nowhere to go but outward, the sharp-edged proof that the weapon which had reigned over the jungles of Malaya had no place in the open light of the Marianas. Inside, the interior was a study in claustrophobia and misplaced faith. The commander's station was little more than a steel box without a seat. The hand crank for the turret traversed stiffly, demanding the strength of a man already trying to aim, load and lead at once. The hull gunner's space could barely contain his shoulders, and the driver's vision slit offered less field of view than the periscope of a submarine. Everything was too small, too fragile, too late. American tank crews who peered inside these wrecks were astonished that anyone could fight in them at all. One Marine sergeant noted in his report that the entire fighting compartment could fit inside the Sherman's turret basket with room to spare. The contrast was almost cruel. Where the Sherman had hydraulic traverse, electric communication, and layered ammunition racks protected by wet stowage systems, the Hago had hand cranks, elbow grease, and loose 37mm shells rattling underfoot. It was a tank from an era when war was imagined as colonial policing, quick thrusts against disorganized resistance, not the industrialized inferno of the Pacific. And yet, to understand its failure, one had to understand what it was built to be, not a duelist but a scout, not a breaker of fortifications, but an enabler of infantry advance. In the flat paddies of China it was lethal, in the volcanic amphitheater of Saipan it was suicidal. Reports sent back to Tokyo after Saipan made for grim reading. Engineers confirmed what the battlefield had already decided. The armor was inadequate, the gun too small, the three-man crew arrangement inhuman under real combat stress. But even with this knowledge, Japan could not change its fate. The factories at Sagami and Kokura were already straining under the weight of air raids and material shortages. Steel allocations went to ships, to aircraft, to guns meant for the homeland's defense. There would be no sudden flowering of new, thicker armored tanks, no miracle in assembly lines that lacked electricity half the time. The Hago's replacements, the Chi-Mu and the Chi-2, existed on blueprints and in prototype sheds, but never in meaningful numbers. For the Marines, the discovery created a quiet revolution in tactics. Every platoon commander who had watched a Ha-Go disintegrate under .50 cal fire carried that knowledge forward. They knew now that they did not need to call for Shermans or bazookas. Their own heavy machine guns were sufficient. This transformed fear into confidence, and confidence into aggression. When Japanese armor appeared in later campaigns, Tinian, Peleliu, Okinawa, the reaction was not alarm but impatience. Crews opened fire without hesitation, and Japanese tank assaults that might once have caused chaos were now cut apart in minutes. The 50 caliber Browning, meant to defend airfields and tear through aircraft fuselages, had accidentally become the Pacific's most efficient anti-tank weapon, and its success said less about its brilliance than about the profound mismatch of errors that played out on every island Japan tried to defend. By the time the war reached its final months, the Ha-Go was not even used as a tank in the proper sense. On Iwo Jima and Okinawa, they were dug into hillsides, their turrets sealed in place, used as static bunkers firing downhill until inevitable destruction. Their mobility, the very virtue for which they had been conceived, was now irrelevant. What had been built for speed now found its only value in stillness. When Marines came across these buried relics, they sometimes hesitated to call them tanks at all. They were monuments, small tragic shrines to a vanished kind of war. And yet inside those wrecks, scorched and silent, lay something profoundly human, the evidence of men who had believed utterly in what they drove. They had trusted that steel and training and courage could outmatch the enemy, because for years that had been true. But Saipan revealed that belief does not thicken armor, and bravery cannot stop a bullet traveling at 2,900 feet per second. When those first 50 cal rounds punched through the Ha-Go's skin, they did more than kill a crew. They ended an era of Japanese confidence in the machines that bore the rising sun. After Saipan, the myth of parity between East and West collapsed not through speeches or propaganda but through factory output and battlefield mathematics. Japan's tankers and engineers, once certain that ingenuity and discipline could offset material limits, now stared across the Pacific at a nation that built tanks like a man breathes, automatically, endlessly, without exhaustion. In America, the clatter of assembly lines was the real drumbeat of victory. The Detroit Arsenal, Fisher Body, Baldwin Locomotive Works, names that once belonged to peacetime industry, had become the new regiments of the war. Each one pouring out MEV-4 Shermans by the hundreds every month, each one feeding a logistical network so vast that tanks shipped across oceans arrived at the front before the paint had time to fade. A single American plant in Michigan produced more armored vehicles in 1 month than Japan managed in an entire year. This was the reality the Ha-Go could not outpace. Every plate of steel that rolled out of a US factory represented not just metal but time, man-hours, electricity and materials that Japan could no longer afford. The empire's factories struggled against shortages that bit into every corner of production, coal that came by ship through submarine-choked waters, copper scavenged from old telephone lines, aluminum melted down from household cookware. The result was not innovation but adaptation, thinner armor, smaller engines, compromises that piled upon compromises until the machines themselves became emblems of scarcity. Japan's engineers knew how to build better tanks. They simply lacked the world to build them in. Meanwhile, the United States had turned industrial warfare into a science. In the gleaming cavern of the Detroit tank arsenal, cranes lifted entire hulls like toys, welders showered sparks in 12-hour shifts, and women who had never touched machinery before 1941 now welded seams on turrets and bolted powertrains into place. Assembly lines ran without pause, 3 shifts, day and night. Where Japan's industrial map was shrinking under bombers, America's was expanding into a continent-wide factory. Logistics, not valor, had become the axis of victory. For the Marines who lived through it, this superiority was tangible, not theoretical. They could feel it in the weight of their rations, the abundance of ammunition, the reliability of the engines that carried them across the beaches. They had replacement parts for everything. They could radio for artillery and get it. Their enemy, trapped on islands and starved of fuel, could not even maneuver without exposing his armor to annihilation. A Sherman that broke down could be repaired within hours. A hago that stalled was a coffin. As the Americans advanced across the Pacific, Tinian, Peleyu, Leyte, Okinawa, the pattern became ritualistic. Japanese tank units would be held in reserve, then thrown into counterattack at night or in desperate daylight thrusts, and each time the result was the same: the metallic scream of tracks, the brief hope of momentum, then the answering roar of .50 caliber guns, bazookas and Shermans. The thin-skinned machines that had once ruled China burned in rows, illuminating the night sky like candles for an empire already dying. Even for the Japanese crews who survived, the psychological toll was irreversible. They no longer believed in their tanks. The armor that had once felt like a cocoon now felt like a trap. In interviews taken after capture, tank officers confessed that when they climbed inside, they felt not power but confinement, not safety but inevitability. One man said, "When I heard the Browning, I knew it was over. I thought maybe the Emperor would forgive us for dying so cheaply." That was the final truth. Saipan had taught that courage and doctrine cannot compensate for the absence of steel, fuel, and production. The hago was not just a technical failure. It was the physical embodiment of a nation's illusion, the illusion that spirit could replace supply lines, that sacrifice could outweigh machinery, that the will to fight could make up for the means to win. When those illusions met the mechanical heart of American warfare, the outcome was not a contest but a demonstration. By the summer of 1945, when Soviet tanks swept through Manchuria in a storm of armor and speed, crushing the last of Japan's divisions like reeds before a flood, there were no more hagos left to burn. What had once been a symbol of mobility had become a relic of futility, proof that in a war of machines, belief alone could not stop a bullet, and courage, however pure, could not make 12 millimeters of armor behave like 75. The Pacific War had revealed something larger than tactics or technology. It showed that the 20th century no longer belonged to the brave, it belonged to the industrial. When the war finally ended, the islands that had once thundered with engines lay silent under the wreckage of empires. American engineers gathered what remained of Japan's armored forces, shipping hagos back across the ocean for study, as if to autopsy an extinct species. At Aberdeen Proving Ground, the U.S. Army's analysts stripped one down to its bones, measuring every plate, every bolt, every cramped compartment, and what they found was exactly what the Marines had already learned in fire: a vehicle designed for a world that no longer existed. Its armor was too thin to matter, its gun too small to frighten, its crew space too tight to fight in. Yet even in failure, it told a story, not of incompetence, but of a nation forced by resource scarcity and geography to build what it could, not what it wanted. The hago was the child of an empire without oil fields, without steel mills on the scale of Pittsburgh or Detroit, without the logistics to fight a mechanized war against industrial giants. Still, the tank carried echoes of an older idea that wars could be won by precision, speed, and spirit rather than tonnage. In this, it became more than just a flawed machine. It was a mirror for Japan's entire wartime philosophy. The same faith that drove its pilots into the sky with half-trained optimism and minimal fuel also drove its tankers into hopeless counterattacks, their diesel engines sputtering toward the inevitable. The same belief that morale could compensate for material limits, that devotion could substitute for steel, ran like a current through every battlefield from Nanking to Okinawa. But war had changed. It had become an industry of attrition, a competition measured in railcars, foundries, and kilowatts. When the Browning .50 caliber tore through the hago's armor on Saipan, it wasn't merely destroying a tank, it was tearing open the illusion that courage alone could win modern wars. That orange line of tracer fire illuminated more than a battlefield, it revealed the future. For the Americans, the battle was confirmation of a doctrine they already lived by: logistics as destiny, firepower as philosophy. The Marines who had crouched behind sandbags with their M2 SES understood that they were not just soldiers but extensions of a machine that stretched all the way back to the assembly lines of Michigan and the shipyards of California. The war in the Pacific, like the war in Europe, proved that industrial strength was the new divine right of nations. Whoever could build the most tanks, planes, guns, ships, bullets would shape the century. For Japan, the lesson came too late to matter. Its tank designers drew new blueprints even as its cities burned. The Type 4 Chi-2 and the Type 5 Chi-Ri promised redemption through thicker armor and heavier guns, but by the time prototypes rolled onto test fields, American B-29s already ruled the skies. Those tanks never left the homeland. They became ghosts of what might have been, reminders that innovation means nothing when you have no fuel to test it. In the decades that followed, as Japan rebuilt from ruins into a technological powerhouse of peace, the memory of the Hago became a footnote, a relic in museums, its thin plates flaking with rust, its small turret silent, yet for historians and soldiers alike, it endures as a cautionary artifact, a symbol of the moment when faith in human spirit met the hard truth of the industrial age. Because on that June morning in 1944, as the tracers cut across the airfield and the Marines laughed in disbelief that their machine guns could do the impossible, two worlds collided, one powered by belief, the other by production, and only one could survive. The Hago was not merely destroyed that day, it was outlived by history itself. When the sun rose fully over Saipan on June 17, 1944, the field was quiet except for the faint popping of ammunition still cooking off inside wrecked tanks and the metallic hiss of hot engines dying in the sand. The Marines moved carefully between them, rifles at the ready, stepping around bodies and steel. A few of them, mechanics, gunners, the kind of men who instinctively wanted to understand what they had faced, climbed onto the shattered Hagos and ran their hands over the armor, tracing the entry holes like doctors studying wounds. They found bullet paths so straight that daylight shone cleanly through from one side to the other. A few men joked softly, others didn't speak at all. One corporal, a veteran of Guadalcanal who had once seen these same tanks as unstoppable, stood staring for a long moment and said only, "Guess they finally met something harder than their prayers." In that silence, what dawned on the Marines was not triumph, but revelation. This war was no longer about bravery, measured in charges or duels of men. It was about physics, industry, and endurance. The Japanese had brought courage in unlimited supply, but courage couldn't make diesel thicker or steel stronger. The Hago had been designed for a world that was already disappearing, a war that was simpler and smaller, where the Empire's ambition could still outpace its resources. But the Pacific had turned into a proving ground for the modern age, and on that ground ideals without infrastructure died first. That morning, the Marines salvaged what they could: spare rounds, rations, fragments of paper maps from inside command tanks, and left the rest to rust. The smell of burned oil lingered for days, mixing with the sweet rot of vegetation and the heavy scent of cordite. And in Tokyo, reports began to filter back through coded transmissions: 31 tanks destroyed, hundreds of infantry dead, no significant enemy losses. The words were clinical, but the meaning was unbearable. Officers read the dispatches and understood, though few dared say it aloud, that Japan's armored core was effectively finished, not by defeat in a single battle, but by exposure to a reality it could not change. The Hago's death on Saipan marked more than the end of a machine. It was the death of an illusion. It proved, brutally and unmistakably, that spirit and sacrifice could not substitute for steel, that devotion to the Emperor could not stop a .50 caliber round, that faith without factories was a kind of suicide. The Empire had believed that its warriors could transcend material limits. The Pacific proved otherwise. For the United States, Saipan became one more step on an unstoppable road toward Tokyo Bay. For Japan, it was the quiet beginning of the end, an unspoken acknowledgement that the war had turned into something the nation could no longer sustain, much less win. The smoke from those burning tanks would rise into the humid sky and drift eastward over the Pacific, faint and invisible, but it carried with it the ashes of an era, of a country that had believed it could fight modern war with the logic of the past. And when the next islands burned and the next battles came, the Marines remembered. They remembered how machine gun fire had punched through armor and how belief had melted in the heat of modern firepower. They would tell each other that story in foxholes and on transports. Remember Saipan, remember how the tanks fell to the Brownings. It became a shorthand for inevitability, a symbol of what happens when courage meets industry. By the time Japan surrendered 14 months later, most of those Hagos were gone, blown apart, buried or melted down, But their ghosts remained, not in glory, but as a warning carved into the iron laws of war, that faith without factories is faith destined to fail, and that even the bravest men inside the wrong machine can only die proving it. In the years after the war, when the jungles had retaken the battlefields and coral airstrips were reclaimed by vines and silence, the Hago lingered not as a weapon but as an artifact. On Saipan, Tinian, Peleliu and New Guinea their skeletons remained half buried in sand and volcanic soil, their once yellow paint bleached to rust by salt and rain. American soldiers returning to the islands decades later found them frozen mid-defeat, turrets locked at awkward angles, hatches gaping like mouths, weeds sprouting through track links. Local children climbed on them, unaware that these relics had once carried the faith of an empire. Birds nested inside the turrets where commanders had once stood shouting orders into radios that never existed. Nature, as it always does, had reclaimed what war had abandoned. But history remembered. In Tokyo, long after the surrender, Japanese officers and engineers quietly published memoirs, reflections on a war they had fought with inadequate tools, but unbroken conviction. Tomio Hara himself, the engineer who had designed the Hago's suspension, later wrote with a kind of melancholy pride that his tank had been faithful to its purpose, if the purpose had been correctly imagined. He understood too late that the purpose had changed, that mobility and simplicity, the virtues of the 1930s, had become liabilities by the 1940s. In a world ruled by steel and octane, the Hago was not a sword, it was a relic of craftsmanship in an age of factories. At the Aberdeen Proving Ground, American analysts kept their captured Hago under careful preservation. For students of armor, it became a lesson in contrasts. The weld seams were neat but thin, the turret mechanism simple, the interior stripped of all comfort. On the test range, engineers demonstrated to visiting officers how a Browning M2 could penetrate both sides of the hull at 200 yards. The observers, veterans of Europe and the Pacific alike, did not laugh. They merely nodded. They understood what it meant. The test was not a curiosity, it was a microcosm of the war itself, precision and abundance defeating courage and scarcity. And yet, for all its flaws, the Hago retained a strange dignity. It symbolized an era of faith in the man inside the machine, an age when soldiers believed that valor could offset weakness in design. For Japan's tank crews it was home, the place where they fought, sweated, prayed, and died. They cleaned it, repaired it, named it. They went to their deaths believing it was enough, and in that belief, misplaced as it was, lay the tragic beauty of the entire Pacific War. A war where men on both sides fought with total conviction that their cause was worth the cost, even as technology outpaced human will. Today, in museums from Kubinka to Bovington, a few surviving Hagos stand under glass lights and polished floors. Tourists stare through railings at their thin armor and small gun, often surprised by how tiny they are. It looks like a toy, someone always says. But for those who know the story, it's no toy. It's a gravestone in steel. It marks the point where the world's wars ceased to be contests of bravery and became contests of capacity. Because on Saipan, when the first .50 caliber rounds punched through that armor and the tanks stopped moving, the age of the small empire ended, and the age of the industrial giant began. The Hago did not just die there, it testified. It showed that courage without resources, faith without factories, and design without vision cannot survive the modern battlefield. Its steel was thin, but the lesson it left behind was indestructible. By the time Japan surrendered aboard the USS Missouri on September 2, 1945, the last Hagos sat hidden in overgrown bunkers and factory lots, their tracks half buried in dust, their guns pointing nowhere. The men who had once crewed them were either dead in prison camps or walking home through cities that no longer existed. The empire that had built them was gone, and the industrial faith that had crushed them was already rebuilding the world. Yet the ghosts of those machines lingered, not in steel, but in the minds of those who had seen them burn. For American Marines, the memory of Saipan became shorthand for the transformation of modern warfare. They spoke of it not as a battle, but as a revelation, the moment they realized that industry was as decisive a weapon as any gun. The idea that a factory worker in Michigan or Ohio could destroy a tank on the other side of the planet without ever touching a trigger became part of the American creed of victory. Every bullet fired from a Browning, every shell fired from a Sherman, had been born on an assembly line. And on Saipan that assembly line had spoken with the authority of a god. For the Japanese, Saipan was something else entirely. A moral fracture, a point of no return. Until that moment, many still believed that sheer spirit could overcome material disadvantage, that the Bushido Code, the will to die for the emperor, could fill the gap between production and destruction. But Saipan stripped that belief bare. When machine gun fire could erase a tank crew in seconds, devotion became irrelevant. Men could still die bravely, but they could not die effectively. The war had moved beyond them. Historians would later write that Japan lost the war the moment it attacked an industrial power capable of producing 50,000 tanks, 300,000 planes, and billions of bullets. But in truth, Japan lost it the morning a Marine corporal realized that his .50 caliber weapon, a machine designed to bring down airplanes, could rip through the armor of Japan's best tanks. In that instant, the Pacific War's moral geometry inverted. The mighty became vulnerable, the confident became obsolete, and the empire that had risen on the promise of speed and daring collapsed under the weight of its own limitations. In post-war Tokyo, as American occupation forces paved roads and dismantled arsenals, a few old tank officers visited the storage yards where surviving Hagos had been dragged. They stood in silence, hands behind their backs, looking at the small, rusting shells of machines that had once seemed like chariots of destiny. One of them, a colonel who had fought at Khalkhin Gol and Saipan, reportedly murmured, "We built them to move fast. We never imagined the world would move faster than us." And he was right. The world had outgrown the age of warriors and entered the age of engineers. The Hago, once the sharp point of an empire, had become a relic of a faith that the 20th century no longer had patience for. Its story, from the workshops of Mitsubishi to the beaches of Saipan, remains one of history's most haunting parables. That courage, no matter how fierce, cannot substitute for capacity. That speed means nothing when you are outrun by time itself. And so the Hago's legacy endures not in glory but in understanding. A quiet monument to the truth that war in the end is not decided by who fights hardest, but by who builds longest. When the dust of the Second World War finally settled, the world that emerged no longer spoke the language of heroism and valor that had fueled the early 20th century. It spoke the dialect of production lines, logistics, and cold mechanical precision. The Hago's thin armor and tiny frame stood as mute testimony to a vanished philosophy, the idea that men could triumph through discipline and will, even if their machines lagged behind. On the scorched plains of Saipan, that dream had been incinerated under the roar of Shermans and the thudding rhythm of Browning Main 2 says, and in its place stood a new creed, that power was measured not by bravery, but by capacity. Factories became temples, engineers became strategists, and the hum of industry replaced the chant of patriotism. In the United States, cities like Detroit and Cleveland were hailed as the arsenal of democracy, places where entire wars were decided before the first bullet reached the front. Japanese intelligence officers had once calculated that America could never sustain simultaneous offensives across the Pacific and Europe. They were wrong. The same assembly lines that produced family sedans in 1939 produced tanks, planes, and ammunition by 1944, and when those tanks rolled onto Pacific beaches, they carried with them the certainty of mass, the unanswerable advantage of a nation that had mechanized victory. In Japan, the aftermath was quieter and infinitely sadder. The surviving designers of the Imperial Army's armored corps gathered in a small workshop in the ruins of Tokyo in 1946 to review what remained of their pre-war projects. Blueprints of the Type 4 Chi-2 and Type 5 Chi-Ri still existed, sleek, powerful machines that might have rivaled the Sherman, but they had never reached production. The engineers stared at them as if at ghosts. They had been brilliant men, capable of building world-class tanks. They simply hadn't had the coal, the steel, or the time. "We did not lose to their soldiers," one of them said quietly. "We lost to their machines." That sentence would become prophetic. The post-war decades proved that the future belonged to those who could build not just weapons but economies, infrastructures, and technologies. Japan, humbled and disarmed, reinvented itself not through conquest but through innovation. The same engineering spirit that had once created the Hago and its descendants turned toward civilian industry, automobiles, electronics, and robotics. Within a generation, Japan became an industrial powerhouse, its factories humming with the same disciplined intensity that once built tanks. The lesson of Saipan had been learned. Never again would belief be asked to substitute for machinery. But in the silence of museums and the jungles that have swallowed the last rusting hagos, the memory endures like a whisper, a reminder that courage without means is a tragedy waiting to be written. For the Marines who fought there and for the Japanese who died in their steel coffins, Saipan was not merely a battle, it was the hinge of an era. On that island, human valor met the mechanical age and found itself wanting. Every war since has carried that echo. The thrum of engines, the precision of assembly lines, the invisible rhythm of logistics, these are the weapons now. And somewhere beneath the vines of Saipan, where the jungle still hums and the wind sighs through the hollow shell of a forgotten tank, the lesson remains carved in steel. The world no longer belongs to the brave, it belongs to the builders. Today, when the trade winds move softly through the Marianas and the ocean glimmers like molten glass under the sun, you can still find them, the remnants of Japan's lost armor, half buried in the soil that drank their last fuel. On Saipan's northern cliffs, a Hago turret juts from the ground like a fossilized animal, its barrel long gone, its hatch gaping to the sky. Coral has grown into the weld seams, rust has eaten through the rivets, and the jungle has draped it in vines as if to hide its shame. Tourists walk past and take photographs, rarely understanding that this relic once stood at the threshold between eras, between a world of human courage and a world ruled by industry. Beneath that soil lie the men who believed in it, crews who went to battle thinking they carried the strength of their nation, unaware that their nation's strength had already been outbuilt, outproduced and outlived. Some died instantly when .50 caliber rounds punched through their hulls, others burned alive in diesel fumes, their hands still gripping levers, eyes fixed on a horizon that offered no mercy. The tanks that entombed them became their coffins, sealed by molten steel and silence. In those cramped compartments where the air grew too thick to breathe, the myth of invincibility died alongside the men who had been ordered to prove it. For the Marines who passed through those battlefields, the image of the Hago burning at dawn never left their minds. They spoke of it in quiet tones years later, in bars and reunions, describing how the armor glowed red before it split, how the air shimmered with heat and the metal whined as it gave way. They remembered not just victory, but the strangeness of pity, that feeling of watching an enemy's bravery meet a weapon so indifferent, so absolute, that it no longer seemed like war, but execution by arithmetic. In the decades that followed, historians tried to quantify what had happened, to chart production graphs, tonnage ratios, and logistics pipelines. But the truth of Saipan cannot be captured by numbers alone. It is a truth that belongs to the sound, the hiss of tracers, the thud, 50 caliber fire against thin armor, the sharp pop of ammunition cooking off, and to the silence that followed when men realized they were fighting ghosts of a vanished age. The Hago, in all its inadequacy, endures as a kind of relic scripture. It teaches what every generation forgets, that courage without capacity is martyrdom, that pride without steel is surrender in disguise, that no amount of devotion can thicken armor thinner than faith. It is not merely a failed machine, it is a monument to the limits of belief. Now, as the waves roll endlessly against the shores of Saipan, they wash over the forgotten graves of steel, whispering the same truth the Marines learned that morning in 1944, that no empire, however devout, can stand against the hum of factories and the rhythm of mass production. The men inside those Hagors fought with everything they had, and that tragically was never enough. By the summer of 1945, the Pacific had turned into a graveyard of burnt engines and broken empires. Saipan was already overgrown, its wrecks half swallowed by vines, its airfields echoing with new American aircraft bound for Japan's cities. The Hago, once the bright emblem of the Imperial Army's confidence, had become an exhibit of irrelevance, a relic so outdated that Marines no longer even registered fear when one appeared. They simply pointed, fired, and moved on. It had taken less than a decade for technological progress to turn pride into obsolescence, for the dream of mobility and courage to collapse beneath the weight of industrial truth. In Tokyo, the generals still issued orders as if steel could be conjured by conviction, as if the same men who built temples could outbuild Detroit. But factories ran on fumes and trains carried air instead of ammunition. When the Americans came to Okinawa, the last remaining Hagors were dug into slopes as immobile guns, ghosts of tanks that no longer moved. By the time the Soviets poured into Manchuria, their T-34Cs rolled through Japanese defenses like wind through reeds, their crews barely acknowledging the resistance. The Hagors' lineage ended not with glory but with neglect. No one even bothered to count how many were destroyed in those final days. They were, in every sense, already extinct. Yet extinction does not erase meaning. The Hago became the quiet witness of a transformation that reshaped the world, the shift from the age of soldiers to the age of systems. Its defeat was not just military but civilizational, the end of an era when bravery could balance scales, when men could believe that spirit alone might bridge the chasm between poverty and power. That illusion died in diesel smoke on Saipan. But for the men who had lived it on both sides, there was something deeper beneath the statistics. Marines who had fired the Brownings remembered the smell of burnt diesel and flesh, remembered the moment the tank stopped moving, the hatch cracked open and a man's hand, blackened, trembling, reached out before falling still. Even decades later, they spoke about that image with a kind of haunted respect. They had not just won, they had witnessed the death of a way of fighting, the moment when humanity's courage was proven irrelevant before its own inventions. And in Japan, for those who survived, the memory became unbearable and sacred at once. Engineers who had once shaped steel for war began shaping it for peace. The same precision that built light tanks would build cameras, radios, and engines that powered the post-war miracle. The lessons of Saipan were not forgotten. They were repurposed. Japan learned to forge strength, not from sacrifice, but from mastery. The Hagos' defeat, humiliating though it was, became the foundation of a revelation that the future would belong not to the soldier who died for his country, but to the worker who rebuilt it. When the last battle ended and the Pacific went quiet, the world exhaled, the air that once shimmered with gunfire grew still, and in that stillness, the wrecks of Saipan, rusting, skeletal, sun-bleached, became monuments without builders. The Hago stood among them, silent and shamed, but also immortal. Its thin armor, its cramped turret, its diesel heart, all of it told a story larger than itself. A story of faith confronted by fact, of courage defeated by calculation. Decades later, when historians trace the lineage of armored warfare, they mention the Hago only briefly, as an evolutionary dead end, a technical curiosity eclipsed by the tanks that followed. Yet to walk through the jungles of the Marianas and see one in person is to feel something words cannot hold, the gravity of futility, the weight of belief. You see the holes punched through its sides, the vines coiling through its hatches, the coral reclaiming its treads, and you realize that this was never just about war, it was about what happens when a nation dreams beyond its means. The Marines who had laughed in disbelief that morning that their machine guns could tear through tanks never truly laughed again about it. For them the memory was too sharp, too final. They had seen what industrial war really meant, not just victory but vaporization, the erasure of human effort by machinery so efficient it stripped death of all ceremony. They had learned that bravery mattered, but scale mattered more. And for Japan, the lesson was carved into the nation's rebirth. In the years that followed, the same discipline that had once built light tanks turned toward peace. The engineers who had built the Hago's fragile frames would go on to forge the skeleton of a new Japan. One of cars, electronics, and precision that conquered the world, not with guns but with craftsmanship. The empire of conquest gave way to an empire of creation. Now, under the Pacific sun, the Hago sleeps, its armor scarred, its purpose ended, its silence eternal. Yet in that silence lies the entire story of the 20th century, how courage met industry, how faith met fact, and how humanity, for all its fire, could not outbuild the machine. Its rusted hull, resting beneath palm shadows and salt air, is not merely the grave of a tank, it is the tombstone of an idea, the last monument to an age when men believed that spirit